really in dispute here. 6 major championships, 3 Masters, 3 Open titles, 97 weeks at world number 1. More Ryder Cup points than any player in the competition's history, a record that stood since he retired from the event and still hasn't been touched. By any measure golf uses to define greatness, Nick Faldo is one of the best players who ever lived, and there's very little argument about that part of his story. The argument starts somewhere else entirely. Ask the people who actually shared a golf course with him. Not the media people, not fans, but the players themselves. And you get a weird kind of consensus. Curtis Strange, who beat him in a US Open playoff, once said Faldo had a way of staring at you like he already knew you were about to make a mistake. Jack Nicklaus, of all people, standing next to him at his own tribute ceremony, called him not real sociable. Rivals use words like intimidating. Teammates use words like distant. Even the people who owe their careers to him tend to land on the same idea: brilliant, relentless, and very hard to actually know. That's the real question this video is built around. Nobody's arguing about whether Faldo was great. He clearly was. What's less settled is whether the people who spent years standing closest to that greatness ever got near the man behind it, and what it cost, on both sides, when they couldn't. Greg Norman's story is the clearest example of that gap. So that's exactly where we start. Faldo and Norman had been trading world number 1 rankings and major championships for the better part of a decade by the time they reached that Sunday, 1996 Masters. Norman had the charisma, the power game, the reputation as the most dangerous player alive. Faldo had none of that. He just kept winning anyway. But nothing between them would ever land the way Augusta did in the spring of 1996. Go back to the final round of the Masters. Norman walked onto that Sunday with a 6-shot lead, the biggest 54-hole cushion in the tournament's history, and told reporters he felt completely in control. That wasn't the whole truth, though. He later admitted he'd barely slept the night before, and told his sports psychologist he genuinely didn't know if he could hold the lead at all. His back was acting up again that morning too, bad enough that he warned his swing coach, Butch Harmon, that this one wasn't going to be easy. He had no idea just how right he'd turn out to be. The lead didn't disappear all at once. It came apart hole by hole, in slow motion, with the whole golf world watching it happen. Norman made an early bogey, then watched a good look at eagle slide just wide on the back 9. Then, at the 16th, his tee shot came up short and rolled straight into the water. That was the shot that basically ended the tournament, right there, in front of a stunned Augusta gallery. Norman shot 78 that day. Faldo, playing calm, unspectacular golf right beside him the entire round, shot 67. A 6-shot lead had turned into a loss, and it still stands as one of the most heartbreaking collapses in major championship history. Then came the part everybody actually remembers. As the two men walked off the 18th green, Faldo pulled Norman into an embrace. Norman has told this story in his own words.
But that was the last thing that I remember that really rattled my cage a bit, when I look back on it.
Faldo didn't want to let go of you. It really looked like that he was holding on. And I don't know what was said, but I think that was like a genuine, I'm excited I just won the Masters, but I don't know what to say to you.
I'll tell you what he said. He said, it was about the media. He said, don't let the bastards get to you. Because, you have to go to the media room. You have to face your music right. Nothing wrong with that. That's part, they got their profession. I got my profession. But that's what he didn't want them to get into my head.
Faldo was talking about the press conference Norman was about to walk into. A room full of reporters waiting to ask him how he'd just lost a major he'd led by 6 shots. For 9 years, neither man revealed what had actually been said on that green. It only became public in 2005 when Faldo wrote about it in his own book and Norman confirmed it himself. For most of the golf world, that became the story. proof that underneath the ice there was a competitor who understood exactly what his opponent was about to go through and empathized with him. Then, in 2026, on the eve of another Masters, Norman changed the narrative. He said, "The hug didn't really mean much to me, because I knew he'd soon go back to being the way he was before. We never had any sort of relationship. We were chalk and cheese. He was a loner. I couldn't be like him." Norman didn't deny the hug happened. He didn't deny the words. What he took back was the meaning. In his retelling now, the embrace wasn't actual warmth. It was a performance, the public side of Nick, gone the moment the cameras looked away. Faldo, notably, didn't fire back the way he usually does. He waited until the following week's Masters had finished before responding at all, saying only that he didn't want to pull attention away from the tournament itself. It's also not the only shot fired between them in recent years. Faldo has taken his own digs at Norman on social media, at one point joking about the anniversary of that 1996 by referencing it as his last shark hunt. The two men are in their 60s and 70s now, both long retired, both Hall of Famers, and neither one appears willing to simply let it go. But Greg Norman isn't the only rival who remembers Faldo this way. He's just the most recent one, willing to say it out loud. Curtis Strange found out what that coldness felt like up close. 1988, U.S. Open. He and Faldo finished all 72 holes tied at the top, which forced an 18-hole playoff the next day. Strange won it by 4 shots. But what's actually stuck around isn't the scoreline. It's what Strange has said about the silence that hung over that entire round. The way it felt to stand across from Faldo with a national championship on the line. This is what he said about Faldo. He had a way of folding his arms and looking at you as though he knew you were going to make a mistake. Strange has also said the two of them barely spoke a word to each other for 18 straight holes. We didn't say 3 words all day, which was fine with me. You should also keep in mind that Strange said all of this after he'd won, so this definitely wasn't a beaten man looking for an excuse. This was the champion, describing exactly what it felt like to compete with Nick Faldo. Then there's Paul Azinger. His version goes back even further, 1987, the tournament that gave Faldo his very first major. Azinger led the Open Championship at Muirfield with 2 holes left to play, then bogeyed both of them. Faldo won by a single shot. At the trophy presentation, with the claret jug about to change hands, all Faldo offered him was one sentence. "Sorry about that." Azinger wrote about that moment in his own autobiography, years later. He said, "I had a rivalry with him. He didn't have a rivalry with me. It was one way." He's repeated some version of that line for decades since, describing a deep animosity that built up between him and Faldo all through the late 80s and 90s, a rivalry that, by his own account, only ever seemed to exist in his own head. It followed him for years afterward. 12 years after Muirfield, Azinger found himself captaining the American Ryder Cup team against a European side led by Faldo at Valhalla. He's admitted that watching Faldo walk in holding the trophy above his head brought all of it rushing back. Now, it would be easy to write some of this off as sour grapes, sore losers describing the man who beat them. Except, the same read on Faldo comes from someone who never had to compete against him for anything. In 2015, at the Memorial Tournament, Jack Nicklaus stood up to honor Faldo as that year's honoree. It's the kind of ceremony where people usually reach for the warmest story they can find. But not Nicklaus. He said this about Faldo: he wasn't real sociable. For about a 10-year period, he was dead focused on what he did. Coming from Nicklaus, a man not exactly known for oversharing his feelings about other players, that's a notable thing to say about someone's personality. It also lines up with something David Ledbetter said years earlier. Ledbetter rebuilt Faldo's golf swing from scratch and probably spent more hours standing beside him on a range than anyone else in the sport. He said, He wasn't the most popular guy with all the players. He was very difficult to get close to. Ledbetter said this years after their professional partnership had already ended, and it ended, notably, with Faldo firing him by letter rather than in person. Even the partnership that rebuilt his entire golf swing, arguably the single most important relationship of his career, ended abruptly and from a distance, pretty much the same way most of his relationships seemed to. That same gap in temperament showed up again just this year, when Tiger Woods got arrested on a DUI charge in early 2026. Nicklaus was one of the first people in golf to speak up for him, saying he felt for Tiger and that everyone around the game wanted to see him get through it. Faldo weighed in on the same story that same week, and went a noticeably different direction. He said he felt for Woods too, but he didn't stop there, adding that this situation was self-inflicted. Two of the biggest names in golf reacting to the same news in two very different ways. For most of Faldo's career, that intensity was simply the price of his greatness, something rivals had to deal with, not something that actually cost him anything. But that changed in 2008. Faldo was named captain of the European Ryder Cup team at Valhalla, the job that's supposed to be the reward for a legendary career. Instead, it turned into the low point of how his own players saw him. Europe lost the cup 16.5 to 11.5, and almost every decision Faldo made that week got picked apart afterward. He caught heat for his wildcard picks. An opening ceremony joke of his fell completely flat. Photographers even caught him reading off a sandwich order during his own pairing notes, and somehow that turned into a bigger story than anything happening out on the course. The British press wasn't kind about any of it either. One paper called the whole week an exhibition in poor leadership. But the decision that actually followed him for years afterward was sending Padraig Harrington, that year's reigning Open and PGA champion, out last in the singles while Europe was already behind. Years later, working as a broadcaster, Faldo went back on television and called his own former player, Sergio Garcia, useless during that 2008 defeat. Needless to say, the reaction to that statement from Faldo wasn't great at all. Ian Poulter, in his own autobiography, didn't hold back. He said, "Faldo has lost a lot of respect from players because of what he said." Sam Torrance, a former Ryder Cup captain himself, called the timing of it indefensible. It was beyond belief that one of our greatest ever players would come out with a comment like that. Colin Montgomerie, usually the most diplomatic voice in European golf, was more measured but still pointed, questioning specific calls Faldo made with the singles lineup that year. Not everyone agreed completely, though. When Graham McDowell was asked directly about it, he actually sided with Faldo's read of the situation. He agreed. "I'd say Sergio was fairly useless that afternoon because he wasn't able to play." And Garcia himself, given the chance to fire back, chose restraint over rage. "I guess he doesn't feel European. I'm not going to put myself down to his level," Garcia said. What really stands out here isn't just that people criticized him, it's who did the criticizing. The same intensity that made Nick Faldo almost impossible to beat as a competitor also made him, by several accounts, a genuinely difficult man to team up with. Faldo himself has since pushed back on some of the criticism, pointing out that a losing captain gets picked apart by people who never see what actually happens inside the team room. He's got a point. But it's worth noticing that none of his predecessors or successors generated quite this much testimony from their own players, all pointing in the same direction. This is where the story gets complicated, though. None of that reputation seems to follow Faldo into the generation of players who never actually had to beat Faldo, lose to him, or play for him. Take Rory McIlroy, for example. He grew up in Northern Ireland with a VHS tape his dad used to put on just to keep him quiet. It was a tape of Nick Faldo's junior golf masterclass. McIlroy has said he'd watch it for hours as a kid. In 2026, when McIlroy tied Faldo's total of 6 major championships, and reporters asked him what it felt like to be mentioned in the same breath, he said, I'm starting to do things that very few others have done, and it's a really cool place to be. Nick Dougherty, who came up through Faldo's own junior golf program, has talked about Faldo with that same kind of reverence, calling him the most driven person he's ever been around in the game. Lee Westwood spent years chasing down Faldo's all-time Ryder Cup points record. He's admitted he wanted it, but he's also been clear it never came before the team. He said, "If you give me a choice of not winning any points and Europe winning the Ryder Cup, that comes first." That's the real difference. None of these guys ever had to compete with Faldo, so they never saw the side Norman, Strange, and Azinger did. To them, he was just the guy on the tape, the one whose game they grew up trying to copy. The clearest answer here might come from the room Faldo chose last, the CBS broadcast booth, where he became one of the most watchable, self-deprecating voices in golf television. In August of 2022, at the same course where he'd made his PGA Tour debut back in 1979, Faldo signed off from CBS for good. His broadcast partners paid tribute, and Faldo broke down before he could finish a full sentence, eventually managing just a few words about being an only child who'd found 3 brothers in that booth. Frank Nobilo's tribute got closest to explaining the whole contradiction in a single thought. This is what he said.
I think to really get to know Nick Faldo, you've got to look at it in reverse. And if you take a look at your broadcasting career, you were bold enough really to show everybody out there, including ourselves, really what's inside your emotions. You weren't scared to do that. But just as importantly, when it came to playing golf, you were strong enough actually not to reveal them.
Trevor Immelman, who Faldo had mentored since the age of 15, could barely get through his own tribute without choking up. "He took me under his wing. He's been a mentor to me ever since. Nick, thanks so much for everything that you've done for me." Ian Baker Finch won the Open himself in 1991, sandwiched right between 2 of Faldo's wins in 1990 and 1992, and called it an honor just to have his name on the claret jug between Faldo's.
I'm honoured to have my name sandwiched between yours on the claret jug, 90, 91, 92. I look at that all the time with great pleasure.
None of that contradicts what Norman, Strange, or Azinger said. It just adds a piece none of them were ever in a position to see. The coldness wasn't the absence of a person underneath it. It was, by several accounts, a deliberate choice. One Faldo only seemed to put down once the thing he built it for was finally over. Except, it never fully went away. Even now, decades past his last competitive round, Faldo still can't quite resist a needle. Just this July, at the Open Championship, he went after Bryson DeChambeau's course strategy on live television, saying he has zero clue of strategy. Bryson responded to this comment, but never said Faldo's name back. He just walked off the course after a 67 and kept repeating the word strategic in his next interview 4 different times without once mentioning Faldo. He didn't need to. Everybody already knew who he meant.
He has, I'd say it to his face, he has zero